I remember it as if the weight of those memories still presses against my chest, as if the chains of our suffering still rattle faintly in the recesses of my mind, reminding me that the past never truly loosens its grip. Between the final years of the 17th century and the bitter conclusion of the Civil War in 1865, I bore witness, as did so many of my brethren, to one of the darkest and most dreadful chapters ever written in the story of this nation, where the soil itself seemed to drink greedily from the rivers of our pain. In Virginia and Maryland, places that once might have offered comfort in their natural beauty, there sprouted instead monstrous institutions breeding farms where men and women stripped of their dignity and treated as mere vessels were forced to propagate life not for love or family, but for profit and cruelty. Can you imagine, truly imagine, the agony that tore through mothers whose infants were snatched from their trembling arms, or the silent weeping of daughters traded like cattle under the cold scrutiny of auctioneers whose voices rang out like the clanging of iron bells? The ledgers and ink strokes of white men severed families with the casual ease of a blade cutting through silk, while the gavel's harsh crack condemned us one by one to separate fates as strangers in strange lands, never to reunite. And there, among the shadows of Richmond, looming like a specter of despair, stood Lumpkin's jail, a name that even now sends a shiver through my soul. Robert Lumpkin, the master of that wretched place, carved his infamy into the annals of our torment, presiding not only over the sale of human lives, but also the brutal suppression of any who dared to resist the merciless machinery of bondage. His jail, hidden away in the dark underbelly of the city, was a cage not merely of iron, but of hopelessness, where the cries of the broken echoed endlessly against stone walls. Beyond Lumpkin's domain, the grand plantations sprawled across the southern states like cruel empires, their proud columns and manicured fields a grotesque display of wealth erected upon the broken backs of those who labored beneath the unrelenting sun. Cotton, that treacherous monarch, sat upon its blood-stained throne, weaving prosperity for the white masters while weaving shackles for us, the enslaved, whose blistered hands and bleeding fingers harvested its softness at the cost of our own humanity. I remember the words of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs' voices that rose from the depths of our shared suffering, chronicling with harrowing honesty the lives we endured. Their words, like lanterns in the suffocating darkness, illuminated the cruelty of our oppressors and offered solace to those who still remained in chains. And then there was Solomon Northup, whose haunting confession still resonates within me. I was seldom whipped save in the ordinary routine and regulation of the plantation, but the whip, nevertheless, was frequently flourished over my head. His admission lays bare the twisted normalcy of brutality we came to accept, as though pain itself had been woven into the fabric of our existence. And so I invite you now, as I carry you through these shadowed corridors of memory, to walk with me along the blood-stained paths of the breeding farms and the endless cotton fields, to hear the voices of those who resisted and those who were crushed, to bear witness to what was done beneath the southern sun. This is not merely history, it is my memory etched forever upon my soul. I remember the day the world changed, though few of us in the fields understood at first the full weight of what had occurred. The air carried whispers of a strange new machine, an invention that promised to transform the fields upon which our lives were tethered. A curious contraption called the cotton gin, birthed from the mind of a man named Eli Whitney, whose name would soon be written in our blood and sweat. Whitney, a young man from Yale, who had traveled south seeking fortune, had no way of knowing the monstrous legacy his creation would unleash upon those like me. For years we had worked these fields with blistered hands, pulling the stubborn seeds from the soft white fibers of cotton, our labor so painstaking that each pound of usable cotton devoured countless hours of our lives beneath the merciless sun. The short staple cotton, which grew best in these inland fields, was a cruel master, for its tangled seeds clung greedily to the fibers, mocking our exhausted fingers. Before Whitney's invention, the great plantations had favored long staple cotton, growing it near the coasts where its seeds could be separated with ease, but the land that could host such a crop was limited, and so too were the fortunes of those who dreamed of wealth. And then in 1793, the cotton gin arrived, a simple machine with brutal consequences. With its metal teeth and rotating brush, it could strip the seeds from the fibers 50 times faster than any one of us ever could, making our slow labor suddenly obsolete, yet not our bodies. For we did not find freedom in this new efficiency. We found instead the tightening of chains that grew heavier with every bale of cotton processed. The fields expanded like hungry beasts, swallowing forests and hills, as plantation after plantation stretched inland, feeding on the profits that now seemed infinite. But the machine that made cotton profitable beyond imagination demanded something else in return: more bodies. Not for the ginning of the cotton, but for the planting, the harvesting, the endless toil that began before dawn and ended only when the darkness blinded our eyes. I watched as the ships arrived at the ports of Charleston, their holds filled with men, women, and children, torn from distant African shores, their faces vacant with terror, their wrists raw from iron shackles. Between 1790 and 1808, the flood of enslaved souls swelled, and the market for our flesh grew insatiable. Even after the law forbade the importation of slaves, the hunger for labor did not cease, for by then, the breeding farms and domestic slave trade would take up the mantle of cruelty. I recall hearing the words of Frederick Douglass later in my life, words that carried the weight of our collective torment. The white man's power to enslave the black man grew out of the very progress of the industry. And it was true. What should have been a marvel of invention became instead a deeper grave for our hopes. The cotton gin was hailed as a miracle by those who profited from it. Spectators, I heard, gasped in awe as Whitney demonstrated his machine, watching with wide eyes as the seeds were stripped away in mere moments. "Gentlemen, there is the king that will rule the South," one man proclaimed. And indeed, cotton ascended to its throne wearing a crown of white fluff and standing upon a mountain of broken bodies. Even Whitney himself would not profit as he had dreamed. His simple design was easily copied, and his patent infringed upon by many who cared nothing for legalities. His letters spoke of frustration and despair. "I have not received 1 cent for my invention," he lamented. But his personal misfortune was a hollow tragedy compared to the devastation his creation had brought upon us. For every acre of cotton planted, a new sorrow bloomed. And as the plantations grew vast and the masters grew rich, we the enslaved felt the full weight of the cotton gin's silent scream. It was a machine that spun not just fibers but chains, tightening around our necks with every revolution of its cursed gears. I lived through the shift, through the moment when the sea of torment changed direction, when the slave ships no longer filled the harbors as they once had, and yet the hunger for our bodies remained as ravenous as ever. With the passing of the law in 1808 that banned the importation of slaves from Africa, many believed naively, perhaps, that the horrors might diminish. But for those of us trapped within the iron grasp of the plantations, the cruelty did not fade. It simply mutated, twisting into something far more intimate, far more insidious. No longer did the merchants need to scour distant shores for fresh bodies. Now they turned their gaze inward, and we, the enslaved already born into this land, became both laborers and breeders, forced to perpetuate our own suffering, generation after generation. I heard them whisper it openly, even as they cloaked their language with cold, calculated terms. Virginia, the land where I was born, soon earned a new and dreadful name, the breeding state. I remember the markets where girls barely past childhood were displayed not only for their strength, but for their fertility, as though their very ability to bear children had become currency in this grotesque economy. Robert Lumpkin, the same man whose jail had swallowed so many souls in Richmond, presided over this vile practice with a cold efficiency. His jail, his Devil's Half-Acre, was not just a place of confinement, but a chamber of forced unions where men and women were paired like livestock, their humanity crushed beneath the weight of their master's greed. I think often of Harriet Jacobs, whose voice rose from the darkness like a fragile flame illuminating the agonies that many of us endured but dared not speak. She wrote of her torment at the hands of Dr. James Norcom, whose twisted desire to possess her body was fueled not only by lust, but by the cold arithmetic of profit. The more children she bore, the greater his wealth. And so he haunted her steps like a shadow she could never escape, turning her very existence into a nightmare from which there was no waking. I have seen with my own eyes the shameful spectacle that Mary Chestnut described in her journals, the white masters parading with their mulatto children fathered in secret, and yet held in chains beside the others. She wrote it plainly, like the patriarchs of old, our men live all in one house with their wives and their concubines, and the mulattoes one sees in every family exactly resemble the white children. It was a terrible truth we all knew, though few had the courage to speak of it aloud. The breeding farms were a silent plague, a shadow that crept into every corner of our lives. Advertisements in newspapers spoke of breeding women, or prime wenches, with such casual cruelty that one could almost forget these were human lives being bartered. The coded language barely concealed the horrors beneath the forced couplings, the systematic violence, the children born into chains, their fathers powerless, their mothers despairing, their families shattered before they could even take root. I have seen young women, their eyes hollow with dread, marched to these farms where the strongest men were brought to them, paired not by love, but by the whim of profit-hungry masters. Some girls were beaten if they did not conceive quickly enough, as though their wombs could be bullied into submission. Families were torn apart, not just by sales, but by the cruel mathematics of forced reproduction, with husbands forbidden to shield their wives, brothers unable to defend their sisters, fathers powerless to protect their daughters. And so, in the silence of the breeding farms, the cries of mothers mingled with the sobs of children, and the whispers of despair clung to us like a second skin. This was slavery, not merely of the body, but of the bloodline itself, a corruption that sought to turn our very existence into an unending harvest of misery for those who saw only profit where we saw the faces of our children. I lived beneath the shadow of King Cotton, a monarch whose rule stretched far beyond the fields, where I toiled from the first glimmer of dawn until my vision blurred beneath the weight of night. This king did not wear a crown of gold, nor sit upon a throne of marble, but instead reigned from every brittle stalk of white that grew beneath the burning southern sky, his kingdom built upon our backs and fed by our labor. His dominion reached across oceans, his riches counted not in coins alone, but in lives broken and sold. Though my world was fenced by the rows of cotton plants and the watchful eyes of overseers, I heard the murmurs of distant lands that thirsted for the very product of my suffering. England's factories, fueled by the fire of their great industrial revolution, demanded endless bales of our cotton, their looms spinning the threads of wealth, while our hands bled to feed them. The ships that docked in Charleston, Mobile, and New Orleans carried away not only the fruit of our labor, but the very breath of our lives, sailing toward markets that cared nothing for the price we paid. I once overheard the words of the historian John Motley carried in the conversation of the master's guests. Cotton is king, and he waves his scepter not only over these 33 states, but over the island of Great Britain and over continental Europe. And I knew then, as did so many of us, that our chains were forged, not just in the South, but linked to the ambitions of men across the world, who never set foot upon these fields, yet feasted upon our misery. The numbers grew monstrous. By the 1830s, cotton exports made up nearly 2/3 of all that this nation sent beyond its shores, and for every bale shipped. More of my brothers and sisters were driven into the fields, their lives consumed to meet the insatiable demand. 4 million souls by 1860 worked beneath the southern sun, their voices lost in the sea of white that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Yet the chains did not end at the borders of the South. I learned in stolen whispers how bankers in New York invested in our bondage, how ship owners in New England profited from our transport, how merchants in Liverpool prospered from the cloth woven from our pain. Our suffering was a currency that lined the pockets of men who never dirtied their hands with cotton thorns, yet built their empires upon our shoulders. Even the land itself seemed to change under cotton's dominion. Towns sprang up like seeds carried on the wind. Cottonwood, Cottondale cotton plant, bearing names that testified to the crop's chokehold upon our world. The very air reeked of cotton, not as a symbol of beauty or bounty, but as a ghostly reminder of the power that held us captive. I still remember the story whispered among us about a planter meeting an English merchant. When the merchant remarked upon the South's dependence on cotton, the planter, with a sly grin, drew forth a single cotton seed from his pocket and said, "Sir, in this seed lies more power than in all the crowns of Europe." And truly, it felt so. We, the enslaved, knew that our bodies were the soil in which that power was planted. I heard the words of Solomon Northup, whose story traveled like a spark in the darkness. The hands are required to be in the cotton field as soon as it is light in the morning, and they do not leave the field until it is too dark to see. His truth was my truth and the truth of millions. We bent beneath the weight of our sacks under the lash beneath the boiling sky, while the world beyond grew rich from our agony. As the war clouds gathered, the masters clung to their king, believing his might, invincible, blind to the truth, that their throne was built upon bones and stained with blood. Yet even then I could feel the winds shifting, hear the faint drumbeat of reckoning approaching. Cotton might have ruled, but no kingdom built on suffering endures forever. The mornings came early for us, long before the sky blushed with the first tender strokes of dawn, and even before the rooster's crow dared break the silence. I would rise from my hard, dirt-packed bed, my muscles aching from yesterday's labor, knowing that today would offer no mercy. The overseer's horn would blare like a summons from some vengeful Jad, and with tired eyes and heavy limbs, we shuffled from our cramped cabins into the endless ocean of cotton that waited for our hands. The sun, merciless and unblinking, climbed higher each hour as our fingers darted through thorny branches, pulling the cotton blooms and stuffing them into sacks that grew heavier with every step. My back screamed beneath the weight, my hands raw from the sharp burrs that sliced into my skin, but there was no stopping, no pausing, no moment granted for rest. The overseer's eyes never strayed far, his whip always at the ready to remind us of our place. Yet not all who were bound to these plantations labored beneath the sun. Some were assigned to the houses where the white columns of the master's mansion gleamed like polished teeth against the blue sky. The women worked as cooks, seamstresses, wet nurses, and housekeepers, caring for the master's children, while their own babes cried for them back in the quarters. Others, like the skilled men on the Montpelier estate of James Madison, were blacksmiths, carpenters, and masons, building the very structures that imprisoned us. Harriet Jacobs spoke for so many of us when she wrote of how even springtime, with its tender blossoms and warm breezes, could not awaken joy in hearts weighed down by bondage. The beautiful spring came, and when nature resumes her loveliness, the human soul is apt to revive also. But for us, revival was a luxury we could not afford. Our souls remained shackled as firmly as our wrists. Still, even in the harshest moments, small sparks of humanity flickered. In stolen moments, while the overseer's gaze was elsewhere, we whispered the stories of our ancestors, tales of faraway homelands across the ocean of gods and heroes of families lost but never forgotten. The spirituals we sang carried messages of both comfort and resistance. Songs like "Steal Away to Jesus" and "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" hid secret meanings guiding the brave toward freedom while soothing the hearts of those who remained. Evenings offered only brief relief. When the sun dipped below the horizon, we would return to our cabins, small crude shelters of logs and mud floors where families huddled together in fragile moments of peace. We shared humble meals, offered comfort to one another, and found fleeting joy in the soft laughter of children who knew nothing yet of the horrors that waited for them. On Saturday nights, if fortune allowed, we would dance to rhythms that echoed across generations, the beats, a faint echo of Africa itself. Yet Sunday, the so-called day of rest, was often filled with labor of a different kind. We tended to small garden plots to supplement our meager rations or repaired the few belongings we possessed. But even these small freedoms were shadowed by the knowledge that they could be stolen from us at any moment. I remember tales of an enslaved man named Cato, who crafted a violin from discarded cigar boxes, coaxing music from scraps like a sorcerer pulling beauty from dust. His melodies brought fleeting joy to our hearts, and for a brief moment, as the notes floated into the night air, we remembered that we were still human. Some masters allowed a cruel illusion of kindness, permitting us to sell small goods at the markets to earn pennies. But no coins, however hard-won, could ransom our freedom or heal the wounds carved into our souls by years of degradation. Charles Ball's words haunted me deeply, for they echoed my own awakening. I was now for the first time made to comprehend the full meaning of the words slave master. The chasm between us and them was vast, and every day beneath the sun, every crack of the whip widened that abyss. Yet even amid the despair, there were those whose courage lit the way. Denmark Vesey, who dared to plot a mighty rebellion in Charleston. Sojourner Truth, who escaped and raised her voice against both slavery and the silencing of women. Their defiance whispered to us across the fields. We are not broken. And so we labored, we bled, we wept, but we also dreamed. In the shadows of those cotton fields beneath the gaze of our oppressors, we clung to the fragile ember of hope, knowing that though the chains were heavy, our spirits remained unbound. Even as the chains rattled around our wrists and ankles, even as the masters tried to strip us of our names, our tongues, our very selves, we held tight to what they could never fully take, the memory of who we had been and the quiet fire of who we still were beneath the weight of bondage. The southern wind carried more than the scent of magnolias and cotton. It carried whispers of stories, songs, and prayers that had crossed the ocean with us, carried from the coasts of Africa to the dark soil of the Carolinas, Georgia, and beyond. In the dim glow of twilight, beneath the sprawling arms of ancient oaks, heavy with Spanish moss, we gathered when we could. There, in secret, the rhythm of drums rose like a heartbeat, echoing across time, connecting us to those we had lost and to the land we had left behind. The beats were not merely music, they were messages, signals passed between us beneath the eyes of watchful overseers who could not decipher their meanings. They were the language of our survival, speaking of hope, of plans, of warnings carried on the night air. I remember how the griots among us, the storytellers, wove the threads of our past into tales that nourished us like warm food after a day of brutal labor. Men like Venture Smith, whose words traveled from mouth to mouth, told of his journey from African kingdoms to the cruel plantations of America, keeping alive the memory of who we had once been. His stories stitched together our fragmented histories, preserving them like fragile seeds that might someday find fertile ground again. Among us, a new language was born, not entirely African, not entirely English, but something uniquely ours. The Gullah Geechee people dwelling in the Sea Islands spoke in a Creole tongue that wrapped English words around African rhythms, creating a sound that felt like home, even in a land that was never truly ours. Their songs, dances, foods, the okra stews simmering in iron pots all bore the fingerprints of our ancestors, refusing to be erased. Though they tore our families apart, we remade them as best we could. An uncle might not share our blood, an auntie might not carry the same name, but in that cruel world, kinship was not born solely from flesh, but from the simple, stubborn act of caring. I watched as mothers cradled their children, singing lullabies filled with both tenderness and sorrow, knowing full well that the next auction block might steal that child away forever. There were those among us who carried knowledge far older than America itself. The conjure women healers and midwives held secrets of herbs and roots, whispers of protective charms, and whispered prayers that bridged the space between Africa and this strange new world. With their quiet remedies and whispered spells, they offered healing, where white doctors offered indifference, and they gave us courage in a place designed to crush us. Our faith, too, became both refuge and resistance. Though our masters sought to mold Christianity into a tool of control, we remade it into a source of strength. Beneath moonlit trees, far from the whitewashed chapels, we gathered in hidden prayer circles, singing spirituals that carried double meanings. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was not just a hymn, it was a coded plea for freedom. The rivers where we baptized one another under starlight washed away not just sins, but sorrow, offering brief glimpses of liberation in the cool embrace of the water. Even the markets of New Orleans, like Congo Square, became places where, for a few precious hours, we danced without permission, where the drumbeats of Africa mingled with new rhythms, where for a moment we were free in body as well as spirit. Strange stories lived among us, too whispered at night, when the children were tucked away, tales of jack-o'-lanterns carrying wandering souls, echoes of African folklore transformed by this new land. Even in these curiosities, we wove our heritage into every thread of life we could. I heard the words of Frederick Douglass, and they spoke for all of us who endured, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." Our struggle was not only for our bodies, but for our very souls, to ensure that even as the masters sought to turn us into property, we would remain people. And through our songs, our stories, our faith, and our stubborn hearts, we preserved ourselves, planting seeds that would bloom long after the last whip fell silent. I lived under their many layers of control, not just the chains that bound my wrists, not just the whip that lashed my back, but beneath a system designed to reach inside my very mind and crush the last fragile pieces of hope that tried to bloom there. The fields were vast, the mansions grand, but beneath the towering columns and sprawling cotton rows lay an invisible machinery far more terrifying than iron or stone, a system carefully built to remind us at every moment that we were owned. In the gray light of morning, as I labored beneath the weight of my sack, I would see men and women wearing the iron collars that marked them as rebels or runaways, thick metal rings fitted with long, cruel prongs that scraped against their shoulders and chins with every step. These collars were not merely punishment. They were silent announcements to all who saw this one dared to resist. And for every collar that gleamed in the sun, dozens more among us lowered our eyes, reminded of what awaited, should we too defy our masters. Then there were the patrols, men on horseback, who roamed the country roads at night, their eyes sharp, their rifles ready, their dogs snarling at their heels. They were the slave patrols established first in South Carolina and spreading like poison throughout the southern states. They carried the law like a weapon, authorized to enter our cabins, to search, to question, to punish, to remind us always that no place was safe, that freedom was not even ours in sleep. The lash remained ever present, its cruel rhythm pounding through our lives, like a second heartbeat. The whipping post stood tall, a monument to obedience, and I saw many fall beneath its cruel hand, their backs torn open, their screams rising to the heavens. I knew that sound. I had made it myself, but I also knew the strange pride in the scars that remained proof that we had endured. I recall the image of Gordon, a man like me, whose scarred back was captured in a photograph that traveled north, showing the world what so many had long ignored. His wounds, once meant to break him, became banners for the abolitionist cause, screaming the truth that words alone could not. But they wielded other tools as well, tools that cut more deeply than the whip. They tore families apart on the auction blocks, separating mothers from children, husbands from wives, brothers from sisters, with no more ceremony than the sale of livestock. I stood helpless as friends were dragged away, their desperate cries swallowed by the laughter of buyers who saw in their pain only profit. Even their religion became a weapon. They twisted the words of the Bible, pointing to verses that commanded us to obey, to serve, to accept our lot as divinely ordained. They preached from the pulpits that God Himself had placed us beneath their feet. Ephesians 6:5, slaves, obey your earthly masters. Those words rang like chains in our ears. But some among us dared to read deeper, to find the words that spoke of freedom and equality. Nat Turner, one of our own, found visions in Scripture that set his soul on fire. In 1831, he led a rebellion that shook the South to its bones, turning their twisted theology upon their heads, daring to claim that God had called us not to submission, but to deliverance. There were strange horrors, too, whispered about in the cabins after dark. The dogs bred not for companionship, but for terror. The Negro dogs, they called them, trained to hunt our scent, to drag us from hiding, to tear at our flesh when we fled. But even here we fought back, learning to wade through water, to mask our scent with strong-smelling herbs, to outwit the hounds that sought our flesh. Harriet Jacobs, who hid for 7 long years in a tiny attic crawl space to escape her master's advances, spoke for us all when she wrote, "I had a view of all that passed in the street, while myself remained unseen." Her hiding place was no larger than a coffin, yet she endured watching the world from behind narrow slats, clinging to a freedom just out of reach. Their power was not only in the iron they placed upon our bodies, but in the careful, deliberate poisoning of our minds. Every rule, every punishment, every sermon was crafted to convince us that we were nothing more than property, that resistance was hopeless, that hope was dangerous. But beneath all their calculated cruelty, a fire still burned inside us. They could bend our backs, but not always our spirits. They thought they owned us completely, body, mind, and soul, but they never understood that within each of us burned a quiet defiance, a flame they could never entirely snuff out. For every chain they clasped around our wrists, we found ways to slip a finger free. For every lash they struck across our backs, we carried the scars like silent declarations that we are still here. Resistance was not always grand or loud, often. It whispered softly, hidden in the smallest corners of our daily lives. I remember the stories that passed from mouth to mouth, stories of Nat Turner, the man who dared to rise. In the sweltering Virginia summer of 1831, driven by visions he believed were sent by God Himself, Turner and his brothers, in bondage, struck back. Their rebellion sent tremors of fear through the hearts of the masters. Though the uprising was crushed, and Nat was hunted, captured, and executed, his name lived on among us as a beacon of courage, proof that even in the darkest place there were still those brave enough to risk everything for freedom. But not all defiance came with bloodshed. On the rice plantations of South Carolina, we practiced a quieter rebellion. We slowed our movements, feigned ignorance, sabotaged tools, and let the machinery of the plantations grind sluggishly under our hands. The masters called it laziness. We knew it for what it was, resistance disguised as incompetence, a way to steal back fragments of power beneath their watchful eyes. When night descended and the humid air pressed heavy upon the land, we shared ghost stories, tales of haints and restless spirits that prowled the swamps and forests. These were not mere superstitions. The overseers, fearful and superstitious themselves, kept their distance from our secret gatherings, unwilling to confront the spirits we whispered into existence. And in their absence, we found stolen moments to plan, to sing, to share dreams of escape. The Underground Railroad was not just a rumor to us. It was a path carved by the brave, a secret artery of freedom that pulsed beneath the surface of America's cruelty. Harriet Tubman, our Moses, walked those paths many times, slipping back into the South again and again to guide others northward. I freed 1,000 slaves. She said I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves. Her words stung with truth. Many among us feared freedom as much as we yearned for it. For what is freedom to those who have never tasted it? Even our quilts became weapons. Sewn by women whose fingers were sore from cotton fields by day, the patterns stitched into those quilts held secret maps, coded directions that pointed the way toward freedom. A drunkard's path meant a crooked road to evade capture. A bear's paw hinted at safe passages in the woods. Every stitch was an act of quiet rebellion, every thread a message wrapped in the ordinary. Our songs, too, carried secret meanings. When we sang "Steal Away" or "Wade in the Water," we weren't just calling upon the Lord. We were sending signals, guiding those on the run, warning of danger, or pointing the way north. The masters heard hymns. We heard instructions. There were darker forms of resistance, too, acts of desperation forged in despair. I heard whispers of poisoned meals, of overseers and even masters falling ill after consuming food prepared by the very hands they sought to command. Such acts were rare, dangerous, but they spoke of the rage simmering just beneath our submission. And then there was the Amistad, a story that made its way even to our distant fields. Sengbe Pierre, whom the world would come to call Joseph Sankey, led his fellow captives in a daring mutiny aboard the slave ship, seizing control and demanding their return to Africa. Though they landed instead upon American shores, their courage forced this nation to confront, even if only briefly, the brutal truths it preferred to hide. Every act, whether the swing of Nat Turner's blade or the quiet sewing of coded quilts, was a refusal. A refusal to accept that this was all we were. A refusal to allow them full dominion over our souls. We were bound, yes, but never fully broken. In the fields where we bent beneath the burning sun, in the cabins where we whispered our grief beneath flickering candlelight, and in the forests where moonlight fell like pale hands upon our faces. Religion lived with us, twisting, binding, yet also freeing. It was both their weapon and our refuge, wielded by the masters to hold us down, and by us to lift our souls up toward something greater than our suffering. The masters sat beneath the tall white steeples of Charleston and Savannah, listening to sermons that assured them of their divine right to own us. Their preachers pointed to the words written in their Bibles. Slaves, obey your earthly masters. I heard these verses repeated endlessly, like a hammer striking against my spirit, as if God Himself had fashioned my chains. They used Scripture to justify every lash, every sail, every child torn from a mother's arms. In their hands, the Bible was not a book of mercy, but a whip wrapped in velvet. But even as they spoke those words, others abolitionists like John Brown and William Lloyd Garrison dared to challenge that blasphemy. Their voices reached even our ears sometimes like distant thunder, as they cried aloud that God made no man to be owned by another. They quoted different verses. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And when we heard those words, a different flame flickered within us, one not of resignation, but of hope. We found ways to take their religion and make it ours. In secret, we gathered beneath the trees, far from their watchful eyes. These woods became our cathedrals, and the moon our lantern. We whispered prayers, not to their distant God of thunderous wrath, but to a God who heard the cries of the oppressed, the God of Moses, who led his people out of bondage. In the night, we became Israelites wandering the desert, waiting for our deliverance. I remember how Denmark Vesey, a man like us, turned the Bible into a sword, sharper than any the master's men carried. He spoke of exodus of freedom promised by God himself. He planned rebellion in Charleston, believing he would lead us as Moses led his people. Though his plan was discovered and crushed, his courage lived on a testament that even their twisted scripture could not fully blind us to the truth of justice. Our songs carried that truth as well. When we sang "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," it was not just a hymn, it was a prayer for freedom, a coded cry for escape. When we sang "Wade in the Water," we sang both of baptism and of the waters that could hide our scent from the Master's hounds as we fled toward the North Star. The music gave us both strength and secret instructions, melodies stitched with hope. And in the rivers where we gathered under cover of darkness, baptism took on meaning far beyond their whitewashed churches. As we slipped beneath the cool water, it was not only sin we washed away. It was fear. It was despair. It was the mark they tried to carve upon our souls. Each rising from the water was a small resurrection, a brief taste of the freedom we longed for. In our cabins in whispers passed from mother to child, the old African gods still lived, merging with the stories of the Bible into something new, a sacred blending of what they tried to erase and what we refused to surrender. We spoke of spirits and ancestors, of signs and omens, creating a faith that was neither fully African nor fully American, but entirely ours. I think of Sojourner Truth, once Isabella Baumfree, who rose from bondage through her visions and faith, and who stood before crowds, declaring both her womanhood and her freedom. Her voice rang like a bell, "Ain't I a woman?" calling out, not just for herself, but for all of us who had been silenced. And so while the masters knelt in their pews and read verses that chained us, we gathered beneath the trees under the moon and prayed to a God who listened. In that secret church beneath the stars, we found not chains, but wings. When the ships from Africa no longer came, I thought for a fleeting moment that perhaps the tide of our suffering might ease, but I was wrong. The masters simply turned their eyes inward, finding new ways to feed their hunger for flesh. The auction blocks still stood tall, the markets still buzzed with cruel business, and we, those already enslaved, became the new cargo, traded like cattle from one corner of this land to another. I saw the great cities of Richmond and New Orleans rise as the new centers of this terrible commerce. Behind high walls within iron-barred slave pens, we were packed like animals awaiting our fate, the air thick with fear, sweat, and quiet sobbing. I remember the faces of children clinging to their mothers, of husbands gripping their wives' hands until they were pried apart by the traders. One moment we were family, the next we were strangers scattered to distant plantations, never to meet again. Men like Isaac Franklin and John Armfield rose to power in these days, profiting from our torment with cold precision. Their headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, became the heart of a monstrous network, orchestrating our forced migrations southward. We were dressed up like livestock, fattened and cleaned, to look fit for sale. Some were even force-fed or muzzled with iron masks to keep us silent and submissive. I heard the metal clink as these masks bit into the faces of my brothers and sisters, dehumanized even before the sale was made. Then came the long marches. They called them coffles, long lines of us chained together, walking for weeks beneath the merciless sun. Sometimes we marched on foot, sometimes loaded onto wagons or packed into steamboats that chugged down the Mississippi, the sounds of chains rattling like some wretched symphony. I still see the roads that carried us south like scars across the land itself. At Natchez, Mississippi, the infamous forks of the road market, I stood among the hundreds waiting my turn to be sold like a sack of grain. The heavy air buzzing with cicadas carried the cries of those torn apart, while the auctioneer's voice cut through us like a blade sold. And with that word, families shattered forever. I once heard the story of Solomon Northup, whose tale echoed across the fields like a beacon for us all. A free man stolen into slavery, his words haunted me. I was soon to learn what I was worth. I too had stood upon the auction block, feeling the cold hands of buyers inspect my body as if I were an ox. Even as they chained us and marched us south, there were whispers of escape, of secret pathways hidden in the night. The Underground Railroad ran like veins beneath the surface of this land, carrying some of us northward toward freedom. Harriet Tubman's name reached us like a prayer, the woman who returned again and again to guide others from the darkness. Her courage became our hope. Sometimes as we marched beneath the stars, we sang songs like "Follow the Drinking Gourd," its lyrics hiding directions beneath their melody, guiding those brave enough to flee toward freedom by following the stars north. Even the nation's capital was soaked in this cruelty. Washington, D.C., the city where laws were written and freedom was promised, was itself a hub for our sale and transport. I heard whispers of visitors from abroad, like Charles Dickens, who could not ignore the bitter contradiction, a nation preaching liberty while selling men, women, and children within sight of its monuments. The bankers issued loans using our bodies as collateral. The insurers wrote policies on our lives, and everywhere north and south, the blood price of slavery seeped into the soil of America's wealth. We were not simply victims of the South, but of a nation drunk on profit. And still, even as we were marched like cattle, our spirits whispered of resistance. In the darkest hours of our journey, in the quiet songs sung between shackles, in the secret prayers uttered beneath breath, we carried our ancestors and each other forward. They sold our bodies, but never fully claimed our souls. I have seen what it meant to be an enslaved woman, to carry not only the burdens of labor, but the weight of terrors that men could not fully know. For us, the days did not begin and end in the fields alone. While our hands bled from pulling cotton beneath the punishing sun, we also labored behind the mansion's walls, where the master's voice called us not as servants, but as prey. Before dawn's first light, I would rise to meet a day already heavy with demands. My hands cracked from the rough cotton bowls would soon turn to the kitchens, the nurseries, the sewing rooms. I cooked their meals while my own children cried with hunger. I nursed their infants while my own lay sick in the cabins. Every moment of care we offered them was stolen from those we loved. And yet the gravest terror came not from the lash, but from the master's gaze, the way his eyes followed us, his breath heavy behind closed doors. Our beauty, what little comfort it might have given us, once became a danger, a curse. I think of Harriet Jacobs, whose story mirrors so many of ours. Her master, Dr. Norcom, stalked her with relentless hunger, threatening her family, her dignity, her soul. She hid for 7 long years in a crawl space barely larger than a coffin, just to escape his touch. I too have known what it is to feel hunted, even when standing still. Motherhood brought both joy and agony. When a child was born to us, we held them close, breathing in the warmth of their tiny bodies, but always with the dread that they might be sold tomorrow, carried off to some distant plantation where our arms could never hold them again. I have sung lullabies to my children, while my heart whispered silent prayers. Please, Lord, let me keep this one. I remember the auctions where babies were torn from their mother's arms like bundles of cloth, where fathers could only stand helpless as their families were carved apart. The cries of those moments still haunt my dreams. Yet even in that nightmare, we found ways to resist. Our quilts became secret maps, each stitch a quiet act of rebellion. I watched my sisters sew patterns that carried hidden meanings. The log cabin design marked a safe house. The drunkard's path warned of danger ahead. The masters saw only blankets. We saw directions to freedom. And there were the conjure women healers, midwives, keepers of old wisdom. Their hands mixed herbs that soothed fevered brows and eased birthing pains. But their whispered chants, their roots and charms carried more than medicine. They carried the memory of Africa, the echo of gods the masters could not name. In their knowledge was power they feared but could not silence. Even when forced to raise the master's children, we taught our own to hold their heads high. We whispered our stories into their ears, stories of who we had once been and who we still were beneath the chains. We taught them the songs, the dances, the words that tied us to the mothers who came before us. And when the weight of it all became too much, some among us made choices that no soul should ever have to face. I have heard of Margaret Garner, a mother who, when faced with the certainty that her child would be taken into slavery, chose instead to take her child's life. Such was the depth of our love and the depth of our despair. But through it all, the labor, the fear, the loss we endured. Our backs may have bent beneath the weight of their world, but inside us burned a fire that even they could not extinguish. We carried not just cotton in our baskets, but entire generations on our shoulders. Though most remember the cotton fields when they speak of our suffering, I have lived through the weight of many crops, each demanding its own price from our bodies, each carving its own marks upon our souls. Cotton was the loudest master, but tobacco, sugar, and rice whispered their own cruel orders, and we obeyed them all beneath the whip. In Virginia, where I first drew breath, tobacco ruled long before cotton claimed its throne. The fields smelled rich and sweet, but there was no sweetness in the labor it demanded. I remember the endless care the plants required, the tender transplanting of seedlings, the careful pinching of buds, the constant attention to every leaf to keep them from bruising. The plants drained the life from the soil and from us too, forcing the masters to move their plantations frequently in search of new ground to exhaust. They called it green gold for its power to make men wealthy overnight. I heard the master's guests laugh over pipes filled with the very leaves I had tended since dawn, speaking of fortunes made and debts paid in tobacco, as if each leaf wasn't watered with our sweat and tears. Further south, in the sticky heat of Louisiana, I labored in the cane fields, where sugar demanded not only our labor, but our lives. The cane grew tall and sharp, slicing at our skin as we cut it down. But the true horror came after the harvest. The boiling houses were furnaces, their fires burning day and night, as the juice was crushed, boiled, and crystallized. The saying among the overseers was true: sugar must not wait. And neither were we allowed to rest, for every delay spoiled the crop. I saw men collapse from heat stroke beside the bubbling vats, saw others slip and fall into the machinery where no one dared to reach after them. The danger never slept in those places, and death was as common as the flies that swarmed the air. I heard stories, some whispered, some shouted, of how sugar did not grow along the Seine in France, but cost no less blood from us here. And then there was the rice, the ghost crop of the marshy Carolinas and Georgia. The land itself fought us there as we waded into the swamps and carved intricate dikes to control the water. The rice fields demanded knowledge, and we brought from African lands where rice had long been grown, carried that knowledge within us. It was our hands and wisdom that built those fields, though the masters claimed the profit. The mosquitoes swarmed thick as smoke, carrying fevers that sickened us year after year. I watched many fall ill with chills and burning skin, while the masters sat dry and safe in their grand homes. Far from the swamps we waited daily. Yet even there, some among us gained small measures of control. Our skills were needed. The masters knew it, and sometimes, though rarely, we could use that knowledge to bargain for a brief moment of dignity, to set our own rhythms in the fields, if only slightly. Each crop had its own way of breaking us. Tobacco drained the soil and our strength. Sugar devoured us with its fires. Rice drowned us in its waters. Cotton whipped us with its endless hunger. But behind every plant that flourished stood an enslaved hand planting harvesting suffering. We were not just workers. We were the lifeblood of every plantation, the silent architects of their wealth, though our names were never written in their ledgers except as property. Every leaf, every stalk, every grain was stained with the price we paid, and the echoes of our labor still cling to those fields even now. By the time I was grown, cotton ruled all. It was no longer just a crop. It was a god, and every man, woman, and child in the South, free or enslaved, bowed before it. I watched as the fields stretched wider each year, like great white oceans swallowing the land, and with every new plantation, more of my brothers and sisters were shackled to feed its hunger. Cotton was not simply king, it was the foundation upon which the South built its pride, its wealth, and its defiance. We were ripped from Africa, from our mothers and fathers, and delivered into this empire of white gold. Our hands made the South rich beyond imagining. By the 1850s, nearly 60% of the nation's exports was cotton harvested by us beneath a sun that burned with merciless indifference. Every bale shipped from Charleston or New Orleans carried pieces of our lives, our sweat, our blood, our broken families across the seas, to feed the looms of England and the greed of men in the North. I heard their arguments whispered at night by those who dared speak, some in the North, growing uneasy, no longer able to turn their eyes away from the horror they once tolerated for profit. Others in the South growing bolder, certain that cotton made them invincible. They spoke of how the world itself would crumble without their crop. The master once repeated what Senator James Henry Hammond had proudly declared: "Without firing a gun, without drawing a sword, should they make war upon us, we could bring the whole world to our feet." And so the nation began to split, not only along rivers and borders, but along the jagged line between humanity and profit. The North's factories thrived on cotton, yet its people began to cry out against the chains that bound us. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin reached even our ears, whispered between the cabins, a book that dared to reveal the agony we lived each day. Her words stirred the North, turning many hearts that had long remained silent. But the South clung tighter to its peculiar institution, wrapping slavery in false words of virtue. I heard John C. Calhoun's name often, as masters praised his defense of slavery as a positive good. They told themselves that we were better off beneath their rule, that we were cared for, that their civilization was noble and righteous. But their righteousness was fed by our misery. The arguments grew louder with each passing year. The Missouri Compromise tried to balance free and slave states, but each solution only postponed the storm. The Kansas-Nebraska Act threw gasoline on the fire, and in its wake came bleeding Kansas neighbors murdering neighbors over the fate of men like me. Then came the madman or the hero, depending on who whispered his name: John Brown. I heard of his raid on Harper's Ferry, his plan to ignite a slave rebellion with stolen rifles and burning hearts. His body swung at the gallows, but his cry for justice rang louder after death than it ever had in life. The South cursed him, the North mourned him, and the chasm between them widened. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, the masters saw doom in his shadow, even though he promised not to interfere with slavery where it already lived. But they saw only the threat. And so the states began to fall away like brittle leaves, one after another, declaring their secession and preparing for war. The Union frayed, and with it came the distant drumbeat of a conflict that would shake the world. I heard, too, of how Britain and Europe watched from across the sea, their looms hungry for southern cotton, yet their people uneasy about allying with a nation built upon our backs. Some said that Lincoln even sent them cotton from the north to show that the South's grip could be broken. The storm had gathered for decades, and at its heart always was cotton. It was never just the crop. It was the chains beneath it, the people it devoured, the lies it sustained. And now at last, the war loomed on the horizon, dark and heavy, like thunderheads rolling across the fields, where we bent low beneath the weight of white gold. Even now, long after the chains have rusted, and the auction blocks stand empty, I feel the fields calling to me not with the sweet scent of blossoms, but with the voices of those who once labored beneath the unforgiving sun. The past, I have learned, never truly dies. It lingers in the soil, in the wind, in the very bones of this land. I have walked the grounds of Monticello Boone Hall and other great estates, once plantations, where we bent beneath the weight of cotton and cane. Now they stand polished for visitors, their grand facades restored, their guided tours carefully balancing what they choose to show. They speak of architecture, of gardens, of genteel southern life. But beneath each stone I hear the muffled cries of mothers torn from children, the rhythmic snapping of overseers' whips, the silent weeping behind cabin doors. After the war, when the South lay broken and defeated, I watched as a different kind of lie was sown. They called it the Lost Cause, a tale that draped the Old South in romance that spoke of honor and noble gentlemen, of graceful women beneath parasols. They wrote stories like Gone with the Wind, where Scarlett O'Hara stood as their heroine, her plantations and slaves fading into the background like harmless scenery. But I and so many others knew the truth that their books dared not tell. The fight for truth rose again a century later, when men like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood beneath the monuments of Washington and declared, "We've come to our nation's capital to cash a check." He spoke of the promise America had made, a promise of freedom that had never reached our hands. His words carried the weight of our ancestors' labor, the blood-soaked cotton fields stitched into every sentence. The schools became battlegrounds where history itself was contested. For years, they had skimmed over our suffering, reducing our lives to footnotes. But new voices demanded the full truth be taught, not just about the war, but about the centuries of bondage that fed the nation's rise. The 1619 Project cast a bright light into the shadows, insisting that America's true story must begin not with independence, but with the first slave ships that docked on these shores. Museums now rise where silence once reigned. The National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington stands as a monument to the stories we carried but were once forbidden to tell. In its halls, I see not just artifacts, but pieces of my own memory, of the millions whose lives fed the nation's prosperity, but who were denied its freedom. Artists like Kara Walker carve our pain into silhouette, forcing America to confront the beauty and horror intertwined in its past. Families, too, dig into attics and diaries, unearthing old letters that reveal ancestors once hidden behind polite histories, some discovering enslaved kin, others discovering the enslavers within their own bloodlines. And with these discoveries comes the long, slow reckoning that continues even now. Yet still I see the monuments that rise to honor men who fought to keep us in chains. Still, I hear the debates whether these stone generals are heritage or hate, but I know what they are. I have lived beneath their shadows. I think often of Frederick Douglass, whose words remain truer with each passing year. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. We struggled in the fields beneath cotton's heavy crown. We struggled in secret gatherings beneath the trees. We struggled in courtrooms and marches, in whispered songs and shouted protests. Now, as I stand beneath skies once heavy with the screams of the oppressed, I pray that the world remembers not for guilt, not for shame, but for truth. For in truth lies the only freedom that can truly honor those who once bent beneath the cotton sun.